The Trump administration, or rather the president himself, according to lawyers, is thinking about a $1 billion lawsuit against the BBC, the latest broadcaster to be targeted by Trump. This after the resignation of the head of the channel and his head of news. It follows the word that a report had been doctored, a report that edited together clips of Trump speaking on January 6, 2021, ahead of the storming of the Capitol.
He has led the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, as Director General since 2020. Tim Davie has now resigned, as has Deborah Turness, the CEO of BBC News. Their departure comes amid mounting pressure after an internal BBC report leaked to the Telegraph newspaper cited failings in BBC coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict, trans issues, and the way a speech by the US President Donald Trump was edited.
As soon as we started publishing our stories, Tim Davie's position had become untenable.
The author of the paper's exclusive, Gordon Rayner, says Davie had known for about 6 months how footage of Trump in a BBC Panorama documentary last year had been edited.
That we've been reporting on. He kept quiet. I think he hoped this would all go away. It hasn't. I think it's also important to make the point that all of these things happened under his watch, and as a result of a culture that has been allowed to build under his leadership.
Trump reacted to the resignations in London, saying, "The top people in the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are all quitting, fired because they were caught doctoring my very good, perfect speech of January the 6th. Thank you to the Telegraph for exposing these corrupt journalists." The Telegraph published an extract of the documentary to show how Trump's speech, made just before the 6th of January insurrection in 2021, had been edited.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
This crisis for the BBC is the latest in a series. The one now sees the White House accusing it of being a propaganda machine.
Well, for more, let's cross to London. Charlie Beckett is a professor of practice Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, and in a previous life worked at the British Broadcasting Corporation. Thanks for being with us here on France 24.
Hey there.
These scalps that were had at the top of the BBC, is it because of what we heard in that report, a bad edit?
Well, I think it's a bad edit that was symbolic of a wider problem, a problem of trust and confidence in the BBC. And I think the two resignations are actually somewhat different. Tim Davie's been there for a while. You could argue this was the final act that made him give up, if you like, through exhaustion. He's probably got the toughest job in public life in the UK. Deborah Turness is slightly different. She was taking much more direct responsibility for what went wrong with that Panorama mistake, this misjudgment, and perhaps the way that was dealt with. But to lose two of the top people responsible for the BBC and BBC News is quite extraordinary.
Is the BBC less rigorous than it was when you worked there?
Listen, old BBC hands always think things were better when they were there. I'm not sure that's entirely true. You have to remember that the BBC, in terms of their journalism and also as an institution, is under much more pressure. It's got far fewer resources, which are spread much more thinly. So there is less oversight. Perhaps there is less rigor in some of their management, but also the political context and the public context has changed. Everybody uses the BBC pretty much in the UK. Everyone pays for it, certainly. And therefore, everyone wants their BBC to reflect their worldview. And of course, it can't do that. It's impossible. But there is increasingly violent sort of cynicism and criticism of the BBC amongst the public as a whole, but particularly amongst politicians, in the same way that Donald Trump attacked media organizations that weren't slavishly loyal to him. So we're getting a much more partisan approach from politicians in the UK, and indeed from our newspapers, like the Daily Telegraph, which has always been very honestly right-wing, but is increasingly anti-BBC.
Increasingly anti-BBC? I mean, we see both the Daily Telegraph and Britain's best-selling tabloid, the Daily Mail. I mean, they've always, it seems, been Beeb bashing.
No, they've always been Beeb bashing, partly because it's an easy target, and it's something that we all hold dear. You've got to remember the BBC is not just about news. It's about documentaries, and it's about drama. It's about local news and local culture. It's embedded in British life. So it's always dangerous, actually, to attack the BBC without a good reason. But I do think it has become more intense, and I think that's partly because of the commercial competition. People, news organisations are struggling to make money, and the BBC they see as a competitor, an unfair competitor, but also our politics. And I think it's not just in the UK, it's not just the US. We see this generally across Europe. Our politics has become more aggressive, and where before journalists were able to say, well, look, we're just the messengers, we're just doing our job. I think journalists are now increasingly targeted by politicians unless they are loyal to those people in power. But let's not forget, the BBC made a mistake here. There are real problems within the BBC that it's struggling to manage, and this is why these two people have gone today. The big question is there anybody out there who can address some of these pressures?
Is the BBC more undermined by this crisis or the one in 2003 when then Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair went after the public broadcaster over its coverage of the war in Iraq?
No, I mean the Iraq debacle and the Hutton inquiry that followed that was a very, very profound moment, and I think especially serious because it was around that conflict. Without wishing to reopen that incredibly complicated issue, I think it was, if you like, the start of this phase of a lack of or a loss of confidence on the part of the BBC, where in the past they were perhaps able to dismiss these kind of attacks. I think since then they've suffered to a degree a loss of nerve. In a way, I was quite pleased with the chairman today, Samir Shah, who's an old BBC veteran who's been away from the corporation for a while, and he's by no means some sort of liberal lefty, but his statement I thought was good. He said, look, we have made mistakes. We should have been quicker to admit them and to rectify them, but overall, there is not a problem of systematic bias in the BBC, and I think that's true, and we desperately need to defend that, not because I think the BBC is superior to any other news organisation, but it is uniquely universal, both in the UK and also globally. There's like 500 million people use BBC services, and they are different because they try at least, like France 24, they try at least to be objective, they try to be evidence-based, and they try to be informed.
At the end of the day, you mentioned the financial strain. Is that what the difference is? When you see U.S. Public broadcasters with a strong reputation of being independent in their coverage, like CBS, like ABC, bending the knee, especially with lawsuit threats from the U.S. president?
No, exactly. And I think, be careful what you wish for if you're a critic of the BBC. If you reduce it, and God help us if we lose it, then you lose an incredibly valuable asset. As I say, a valuable asset for the UK. I think it acts as a benchmark for journalism. It acts as a useful alternative for people, apart from, the commercial news organizations. And if you talk to people, in America, the one thing they would love to have is a substantial, serious, relatively objective source for their news, because as you said, those who are competing for advertising and so on are always going to be subject to threats to their profits.
Charlie Beckett, so many thanks for being with us from London.
Thank you.
Stay with us. There's much more to come. More news, plus the day's business and sports. You're watching France 24.